Should we start? Yeah. I'm not sure this is. Might have to hold this so I get lots of noise. All right, I'm going to get started. Let me set my timer. How many people have heard of the Sailfish operating system? Sailfish? No? So it's developed by a company called Jolla. They left Nokia and they started their own company. So Jolla has come out with a Sailfish operating system. Runs any Android app, but it's an open source Linux-based kernel. Very cool. And it's already being distributed. They're releasing them already in Finland, so they've had limited distributions. And it also has a hardware interface, so you can take the back of the phone off and plug the back of the phone on. So you can develop your own hardware. It's got this dual shell capability. It's kind of cool. All right, my name is Davi Ottenheimer. I'm talking about big data today. And I titled this talk, Baby Got Risk. I like big data and I cannot lie. It doesn't really have anything to do with rappers or hip hop, but I just like the fact that, I don't know, I do like big data, and I find that the more big data you have, the more risk there is. This is sort of the equation I've been learning. I'll give an introduction to myself, and then the topic, and then we'll go through some of the vulnerabilities and threats I've been finding, and then the overall picture of why there's so much risk. So it does have a gravity theme, which is just coincidence. A long time ago, some people and I were talking about big data, and we decided to sort of tongue-in-cheek call it heavy D. And I did give a talk about heavy D. And the more I think about it, the more this makes sense. And then I ran into some data scientists who were talking about data as gravity. So this presentation has a lot of gravity references. Basically, this is sort of how to stay safe when data gets heavy. But let me start off by talking about the overall theme of this presentation is really about intelligence. And that's because there has to be structure for something to be known. I feel like this is sort of a fundamental philosophy tenet. So for you to really say that you know what's north, you have to have some structure, north, south, east, west. And if there's nothing else you take away from this presentation, it's that I hate streetlights, right? The red, the green, they really make no sense to me. Anybody know where they came from? Why we have red and green? Sailboats. So historically, a lot of industrialization borrowed from sailboats. So elevators use the cables to go up and down because sailboats use cables and pulleys, and right, there's a lot of bridges, suspension bridges, all based on sailboat technology with suspension lines holding the masts up. So streetlights were the concept of red means slow down, green means go. There's no stop in sailboats because there's no brakes. You're always moving around, you're in this constant state of motion. And the problem is when we transferred that to automobiles, it's like the dumbest solution possible because now you sit at a streetlight that's red waiting with no traffic. So if you build big data security the way that we've built streetlights for cars, it's going to be a horrible failure. Like this is one of the primary failures, I think, of security controls in traffic. And traffic is an example of big data. Tons of the devices, millions and billions of devices moving around really fast all over the world, and we're controlling it in the stupidest way possible. The future actually is smart streetlights that can use game theory to figure out which should be on and off. So we're beginning to develop smarter streetlights, and then beyond that, the devices themselves, cars, if you will detect each other and be able to bypass each other like sailboats did. Or like people do. When you walk down the street, you don't have a light that tells you whether to walk past somebody or not. You actually detect that person, and then you know how to move around them. And that's sort of machine learning, that's intelligence, that's the future. Streetlights are a horrible implementation of a control, and I'm afraid some of our solutions are based on some of the same assumptions around streetlights. And this actually is an XKCD comic making fun of the fact that I guess he goes to an intersection and he cannot figure out which way to go. I always walk across streets regardless of the light because I say I'm smarter than the lights. And when the police try to stop me and say, were you jaywalking, I like to talk to them about why I think lights shouldn't even be there. I've only been given a ticket once. So who am I? My name is Davi Ottenheimer. This is my Twitter handle. I've written one book called Securing the Virtual Environment. I'm working on the second book now, Securing Big Data. It's called The Realities of Securing Big Data. I started off writing it the same way that I wrote the other book, which was a hands-on practical guide to securing an environment. And I quickly realized that is not possible. There is actually no way right now to build a secure environment using cool tools. We're still developing them, and they're coming out all the time. And I don't want to expose too many people, but there are other companies that market themselves as a secure implementation of big data, and it's really paper thin. It's like you can put these controls on, and as soon as you do, your entire environment breaks, and no one wants to do that, so you're not going to put it on. Right? And some of the talks I've gone to on security talk about Kerberos, which is one of the advances we have, and no more than a few minutes into those talks, somebody always asks, how do we get rid of Kerberos? So we're still in the very beginning stages of securing these environments. My background actually is in history. That's where I started originally. And then after 19 years or 20 years almost now in InfoSec, I'm much more of an InfoSec person, but you might see me on Twitter arguing with people about history because I just can't get it out of my system. If somebody says something stupid about history, I have to jump in and start fighting with them. And then I work at EMC now, so a little bit of a shout out to EMC. A lot of people don't realize that EMC is a data protection company, now considered the largest data protection company in the world, and we're made up of these 4 components. So people always ask me if I work for RSA because I work in security, and actually I don't. I work at EMC, but we use a lot of RSA in Pivotal and VMware. And Pivotal really is the big data component of our company. So EMC definitely is part of the equation. We're the parent company, but we're part of a 4-brand hybrid. And the way it all fits together is like this. We have a big data, a cloud circle in the Venn diagram, and then a trust circle. So I work on the messaging in the trust area, and I try to help people see why cloud and big data are really trusted. And this is something that jumped out at me. So this is kind of how it all came to the front. I noticed that the Hadoop operators and the Hadoop administrators and database administrators are really struggling to keep their systems running optimally. And from an EMC perspective, that's what we focus on, availability, optimization, VMware as well. But as we bleed into Pivotal and RSA, we start to get more and more capability with the actual data. So this presentation will go through some of the infrastructure concerns and then sort of end up with actual risk in the data itself. So that's me. A quick disclaimer, my background is not math, statistics, and computer science. Mostly, I like those things, but mostly I focused on human behavior in my studies. So I studied why people would intervene, the ethics of intervention and attacking. So that's one of my favorite topics. But I really came from an anthropological background. I ended up with a history degree. And so I find this interesting because when you talk about machine learning, it's about the opposite, really, in a lot of ways, of what you learn in math and computer science. So math and computer science, you start off with a structure and then you try to figure out how to use it. You learn your structures, and I always resisted that. I was always like, why? Why is this structure the one we should use? When you study human behavior, you start off the opposite. You're like, I don't understand at all what people are doing. I'm going to try to make sense of it. And the more we look at big data as a risk environment, it's more the latter. It's more about human behavior and exceptions than it is about things following the rules. So, and this is my favorite anthropology cartoon, where this guy says, he says his tribe doesn't have a written language, and you can see the little bubble with what he's saying above. So that's a big data joke now too. One of the things that's happening though is we're noticing this massive spike in big data, right? Everyone's talking about it. And I really want to encourage people to join the security field in big data because there's so few people now that are working on this. There are definitely some people that are working on aspects of it. But I feel as a whole, a lot of the security teams are not looking at it yet. The Hadoop infrastructure is sort of off somewhere in a development environment, or it's being run in the cloud somewhere that they're not responsible for. And we really need to get more and more people putting pressure on these environments. 43% increase in the investor presentation and conference call mentions of big data. Notice also cloud computing has completely disappeared. So don't say cloud computing anymore, just say cloud, right? It's these interesting transitions and what people are trying to get money for. But what this means is we're going to see an explosion of companies doing big data. I've already seen this. Just the other day on Twitter, you might have seen, I was talking to a company about their big data tool, and I said, where's the security in this tool? And they wrote back, please try it. So I wrote back, your certificate is broken, and then radio silence, right? You want me to enter in all my information into your form, but you have a bad cert, and then they're fixing it. So as I mentioned, data is the new center of gravity. And what we say in EMC perspective, right, we have the cloud, we have mobile, we have social, and they're circling around data. And then trust is responsible for all of it, really. So if you think about that, it's actually kind of a powerful metaphor because the more data you get, the more gravity it has, the more your mobile app can be like really powerful because it's circling around this planet that has lots of life, right? Diversity and so forth. Same for cloud. The most powerful cloud has the best data, the most data. And so if data is the new center of gravity, you start looking at some industries and you see they're already feeling the effects of having very heavy data. So whether it's finance or whether it's retail, you're seeing a lot of people that are actually applying analytics to data to get insights. So for example, this is an actual graph from a real project we did at Pivotal where you see that there's insights pulled out by focusing on some specific aspect of data. You visualize it and you find something and then you tell people, for example, this is the length of time somebody's in a hospital, or these are the number of machines that are infected with malware. You're finding it by looking at very complex data sets with sophisticated tools. So great. Why is this different from anything before? Other presentations I give a whole list of all the industries and how they actually are doing big data and how they've been doing it for a long time. Astronomy, for example, has been looking at stars forever, or even dust in space, right? Analyzing dust. They've been looking at lots of data sets for a long time, and they've used lots of terms. So we have data archaeology, that's one of my favorites, predictive analysis, advanced analysis, but machine learning is the latest one you'll probably hear. And what's really changing, I think, is the size, the magnitude of the data. That's sort of an understatement. It's not just that you have lots of data, it's that you're sharing more and more data. And so if you go to a data science summit, for example, I went to one the other day, and again on Twitter I said, hey, there's no security here, and people said, it's a data science summit, of course there's no security here. It's all about data science, not security. And they really have this focus of moving data into these giant lakes. And bigger the lake, the better, and they just keep moving. So they're breaking perimeters down, and they don't want security because they think of it as a perimeter that's blocking their progress. So our security has to change. The way we talk about it, the way we address it has to be non-perimeter based, or at least has to shrink perimeters down to where they're very small and very purposeful. So that's what's really different. And what we're seeing, so this is an example, you have, airline maps where you're mapping out where people are going, how fast, what the risks are, all that sort of data. And if we get into some of the details of it, we see, for example, you can reduce the inefficiencies of flying, and you can save money, and of course you can save lives. So who doesn't want to save lives if we look at that data? So if you're in security and you're putting up perimeters, you could be blocking potentially some revelation that's going to save people's lives from flight. And one of the things I talk about actually when people ask me about regulation is how Africa has so many plane crashes. Because I find that a lot of people that talk about regulation and using the NTSB, for example, as a model for like how we should look at vulnerabilities, always look at the successes of the airlines, and they look at how it's worked. But they rarely look at the failures. And that's one of the things I'll talk about later. But if you look at Africa, it has huge catastrophes in airplanes. In fact, just recently, the entire airplane crashed in Mozambique that was going to Angola. Not many people reported it, but it was kind of strange because it was a brand new airplane. It was like a experienced pilot. Like everything looked right, but still it crashed. So analyzing the data, and I'm not the first to suggest that. The United Nations actually has done a big study because they were sending aid workers there, and their aid workers were getting killed in plane crashes, and they wanted to understand why planes crash in Africa. Just a hint, the first 3 reasons were related to infrastructure and regulation. They weren't related to technology. And what that tells me is that if you do a big data analysis of risk, you sometimes find out that you need regulation. You don't necessarily need better tools. It's not the planes, it's not the GPS, it's not the navigation console. It's actually that the runway was being used for a soccer pitch, and when they landed, there were rocks all over it for goalposts, right? Stuff like that. So you need tight regulation. So this is some real data. There's 60,000 some routes, and there's a terabyte of data coming per engine. And so GE is one of the big backers of the big data revolution because they're looking at dumping data while the plane's flying, so when it lands, they can have it ready for repair, which increases, of course, the reliability and reduces the time for the planes to turn around, all sorts of benefits. There's 500 gigabytes of data per 787 flight. Apparently there's more data on a 747, which I thought was interesting. But bottom line is you can see things like they removed paper from the cockpit, and they found that they saved 400,000 gallons a year by moving people to paperless. So there's all kinds of weird analysis of like how long things take, where they should go, routes, and safety. So it's an example of some of the big data stuff going on. But we're moving into this new world of creepiness. And so it was one of my favorite quotes. I'm not saying she's a gold digger, but she's got a lot of mining equipment. People are doing some weird stuff with big data, the airlines in particular. So Delta came out and said, we have massive amounts of data, and they even said, we know who you are. We know what your history has been. It just sounds creepy. We can customize our offerings, which is the last thread, which you'd think you'd say first. We can be very service-oriented, but no, he's saying, I know where you've been. I know where you're going. I know if you've been naughty or nice. So the Associated Press in the exact same article, which I thought was strange also, the journalist who wrote this article then said in the article, airlines do not have the balance yet between being helpful and creepy, which I think we could all agree with. They tend not to be very helpful. So where is this taking us? Well, in 1968, there was a big resistance to the big data movement. There's a lot of social resistance, and I think we should go back and look at some of that. So for example, this Italian guy wrote World Memory, where he says, if you auto-transcribe infinitely, which is basically what we're doing with the NSA argument, he says it just leads to murder, right? It's a bad thing, it takes us down a bad road. You've got Orwell, you've got others, but 68 seems to be the time period, 68 to 71, when people really did a lot of analysis of surveillance. Here's another example. So Stanley Kubrick's 2001 came out in 1968, and I did a whole presentation on this once, where basically the idea is that you create this machine learning thing, right? This robot, you know, HAL, and it basically is supposed to take care of you, and instead it kills you, which is sort of the same thing that the Italian was saying. So if you give infinite knowledge to some machine learning algorithm, at some point it just tries to work against you. So it's going to turn out bad. So we have a lot of, science fiction that tells us it's going to be a bad thing. And we also have some like self-awareness about surveillance. We think of it as a horrible thing. But I like to point out to people that oftentimes we don't think about surveillance in the right way. So I tell this story a lot. I went to China multiple times, and each time it got different for me because the first time I went, I was very suspicious of surveillance. I was looking for it, and I was looking for people getting into my laptop. But by the third or fourth trip, I was noticing that they would fold my laundry for me when I was leaving the room. And they would even go through and wrap my USB cables in my bag up and neatly put them back in. So I started to think of it more and more as like a service that they were providing. And I started to think, what if they cleaned my email for me and got rid of the spam and provided other services? If they are watching everything I'm doing, then might as well make it beneficial. And so this is this weird balance. We often resist surveillance without realizing that a lot of it's beneficial. And I'll tell you this, the future really is about surveillance. So anybody here work at Salesforce or Google SaaS providers? With SaaS providers? For SaaS providers? So one of the things we're going to have to do is close the gap between what the SaaS providers do and what we do. Why? Because the SaaS providers do not know who you are. They give you some way of identifying yourself, but ultimately if you come in, they can't tell if somebody else comes in with your credentials. And it's not always their responsibility to figure out the difference. But if you watch with surveillance your people and can see what they're doing inside the SaaS, now you suddenly have a way to see that the SaaS has been attacked, right? So surveillance becomes a way to protect yourself even in the SaaS model. We think of them as doing surveillance, we want to block them, but really think about doing surveillance of your own environment. So that's kind of the future, and that's where we're headed with some of the tools. So a vast majority of people, almost 90%, think they can actually keep control of their data, right? You've got all these systems watching you, surveillance all around us. You actually think you can erase your tracks, and this is a big mistake. It's not true. This is a survey that shows this is the number of people that are trying to do this actively. But I can tell you, for example, this is a profile of a big data project that was working in the medical field. So these are the sorts of data points that they have about you if you ever touch the healthcare industry, right? Touch at all, like do anything with the insurance companies or go in for treatment. They start tracking tons of stuff, family history, your history. You're basically signing away all sorts of information. And to reduce or remove this information is impossible. So we'll talk about how to attack that in a second. But even better example, of course, is the NSA, when there's all sorts of data points that are so far outside your control. For example, the size of your email. How many of you actually change the size of your email to evade surveillance, right? Constantly shifting the number of packets that you're sending in per email message to make sure there's no pattern that people can pick up, right? So, but that's what they're tracking, is that sort of behavior, or the time it takes for the mail messages to go through the routers. So here's an example that's actually very real. We leave basically an exhaust. We leave a trail of bits everywhere we go, and people are sitting there watching all of that and collecting all of that. And so you can call it lots of different things. Metadata, that's the latest thing. You hear people talking about the metadata trails. But there's also waste, there's shadows. This is a waste example. So in Chicago, there's 1.5 billion gallons a day. This is true of every city, but in Chicago, there's a lot of wastewater that's being run through processing plants, and they're authorized to look for risk, like drugs, diseases, environmental risks that might, they might kill fish, for example, if they let the water back out. Even though the FDA doesn't look for a particular toxin, they might actually find the wildlife is dying. So there's a gap between our regulation and the actual health. So they're doing this analysis of big data analysis for good results. Well, they also found out, some researchers found, that they can do a map between the prescription drugs that were bought in a block, a neighborhood block, and the drugs that were found in the wastewater. And now they can find if you have illegal access to prescription drugs, or if you're taking drugs like cocaine, or if you're taking marijuana, because the wastewater is an analysis of, by block, of the type of drugs that you're using or taking. So that's an example of how hard it is to get rid of this. So this creates, back to the gravity analogy, this anti-gravity movement. People are like, get me away from the heaviness of that data, because that's so powerful. It can tell so much about you. How do I break it or get away from it, right? It's inevitable back to the 1960s. So another way of looking at this is, can we provide tools that allow people to levitate off the planet, right? It's like the airplane. Can we actually give them heavy D controls? I know this is a stretch to the analogy, but here are some examples of stuff that we're working on. One, in-memory encrypted real-time parallel processing. So it never actually gets stored anywhere. It's used and destroyed. And people talk about homomorphic encryption, which I think is mostly smoke and mirrors right now. But it is a theory that we could get to a point where you can do analysis in memory and never actually see the data. You can see enough to do analytic analysis of it. You can do analytic processing of it, but you don't actually see the data itself. So 2 is de-identification. There's a new industry which needs a lot of help from security professionals in how to de-identify data. This also is homomorphic encryption, for example. But if you want to look at data without seeing the actual identities of people, for example, groups of people are within this age as opposed to here's their birthdays, then that's another thing we can do. And 3rd, secure wipe. There's some interesting new emerging technologies that allow us to encrypt data in a way that when we destroy the key, then it's going to be protected when we allow it to continue to float out there because it's not decryptable. We'll never be able to actually go out and delete the file. It's just going to keep replicating on its own because it's going to be stored somewhere we don't have access to, but we can protect it in a way that if the key is gone, it doesn't matter, it's garbage. And then 4th, I could do a whole presentation on this alone, but the integrity of data science is now a huge topic. There's a new group that's being formed just to talk about the ethics of data science. And so, for example, there was a guy who proved that cloth diapers are more harmful to the environment, and that is why we use disposable diapers. That is a real economic example of how someone gamed the system, proved something which was arguably false, and now the entire industry is focused on disposable diapers instead of cloth diapers. And this was in the 70s or 80s, I believe. Another one is that pink and blue are gender specific. This is something which has been sort of promoted over and over again, so people start to think if something is true, it creates a whole industry, and this helps like sell to you. Just sort of make a point on that. In the United States, in 1918, it was the reverse. The generally accepted rule was pink was for boys and blue was for girls. So we have the ability to game these systems in order to get results we want, in order to sell people things we think are good for them. Bitcoin is a good example of how you're gaming systems. And then finally, bacon being healthy and tastes good. This is totally fabricated. So people didn't really eat bacon for breakfast until this guy was able to use a scientific study and say 9 out of 10 doctors recommend a hearty meal for breakfast. And of course, or a heavy meal technically. And a heavy meal requires you to eat some sort of like meat. And this was funded by the pig industry, which was seeing declining sales. So everybody that goes on and on about how great bacon is just playing into this marketing effort that was put together based on some shoddy data and someone who gamed the analysis of the data. All right, so we can control some of that, not all of it, but we can definitely do some work. So let's talk about the vulns and threats now. Those are some examples of how things have ended up the wrong way. Let's go look at the actual things you can do to attack. So what tends to be, and this is why I like the human aspect of it, I focus on this, but it tends to be that human flaws are the actual flaw in technology. I remember a long time ago, somebody from Harvard working on a PhD called me and said, I need to talk to you about computer flaws and what causes them. And I said, humans. She said, no, I need to figure out what really causes flaws and how do computers make mistakes? And I said, humans. And she just wouldn't stop. I was like, it's humans, I swear. They don't make their own mistakes. And so she's like, this isn't helping my thesis. Goodbye. But I stick to that. I really don't think computers yet are intelligent enough to make their own mistakes. Google's arguing against that now because their computer was able to recognize a cat on the internet. I don't know if you saw this story. They have a big data algorithm now that supposedly learned itself learned that what a cat is. And I haven't looked into the details, but I think it's bogus. So let me give you an example of an actual mistake made by a computer, if you want to call it that. In 1996, I was actually working on some project teams related to this, but the Ariane 5 rocket was detonated after it went off course. And it was a simple overflow exception. It tried to do a conversion from 16-bit to 64-bit, I believe, and failed. So it was a floating point error. And the studies that came out of this just said, first of all, don't let software exceptions cause mission-critical failures, right? That's just like a bad design flaw. And you'd think you'd know this by 1996, but in fact, it still happens. And so they also said software should always be assumed to be faulty. So if you look at some of the shifts in the big data environment, Netflix is famous for saying, you know, chaos monkey and all this stuff as if it's new. But we've known for a really long time, and we've studied a lot about how these big data environments with lots of components should be treated as though all the components can fail. And when we say that they can fail, it usually means some human has made some error, or caused an error, or wrote something and wrote it the wrong way. So these fast-moving environments, actually another point on this is the device that caused the error wasn't even supposed to be on. After liftoff, it should have been shut down. It didn't do anything. So they lost billions of dollars in all the scientific research. So let's look at the process itself and some of the details. What usually happens when you're trying to do heavy D is you try to find some meaning in the data. So you have big data and you go through to try to predict the number of events or the categories that they belong to and compare them, right? So how many people know this pirate company, R? That joke never works. R, pirates. All right, so R is a company, and they have some really good examples. Basically, you can go on and you can see how, for example, this is a Twitter feed analysis. It shows you what's the most common word used in Twitter. So in this case, R comes up a lot, data, mining, simple analysis. And then if you do a more powerful analysis, you can see the relationship between the words. So you can see that mining is related to data, for example. Whereas in the previous example, R and data aren't connected. There's no way to know exactly the relationship. So that's the process that you try to break. You would try to, if you were an attacker, you would go in and say, okay, if they're going to try to classify and regress, right? If they're going to try to tell me the most common form of jazz played in mining, should be Coltrane. That sort of worked. All right, so if you want to try to stop people from classifying regress, then what do? You do things which make it harder for people to recognize you, camouflage, for example. Or you try to make it look like you're not doing normal behavior, you're doing abnormal behavior. All right, so at the same time, the function of big data is that it's a super fast moving environment. So in Pinterest, for example, they're trying to keep 70 million people in memory because every time they log in, they want to have all the latest connections. You don't want to wait a day to see that your connections have changed. If you follow somebody, everybody else wants to see who you followed. If you like something, everybody should see that you liked. So while they're trying to build relationships, and this is their relationship algorithm map, while they're trying to build those and you're trying to attack them, everything is live and in memory, right? So it's very, very fast moving. In fact, it's so fast that we're moving to this environment. This is an example of crashes and spikes in the market that allowing the computers to do the thinking for us has created these artificial stock crashes in microseconds. So the argument I've read is that the fastest thinker in the world, they call them the chess grandmasters, they think in some fraction of seconds, right? So 600 milliseconds is the time it would take a chess grandmaster, and these computers are making those decisions in half or less that time. So even the fastest thinking risk analytic human couldn't keep up with these computers. And so what they do is they artificially create a crash, they artificially create a spike, and they're saying that there are mobs of them now that are running the financial trading systems, right? So these minions probably have a mind of their own. They're trying to get lots of bananas, and at the same time, we're building these environments that are pretty much open. So as the minions come in and they find these environments that they should be like looking for risk or trying to prevent risk, we're building them with open lakes of data. We're building them so the networks themselves are open with weak authentication. We're allowing the web services to be open, unauthenticated access. We're using fewer roles than we probably would normally. So HDFS is running everything. So it's kind of an interesting situation. It's like we're moving into this environment and allowing these systems to make decisions and at the same time putting few controls in place to prevent bad things from happening. So with that, let me give you 3 examples. There are lots of different categories, but I'm just going to go through 3 examples here of how you can model threats in the big data environment. So what you would do, actual attacks that you can do, and these are examples from real life too. So for example, this guy dressed up as Bigfoot and ran around the national parks and interviewed people. And his point was that it doesn't exist, right? Oh, look, you caught me, I'm Sasquatch, haha, Bigfoot. And they actually sued him, the national park sued him for harassing park visitors. And he went to court in a Bigfoot suit, in an orange jumpsuit, and tried to argue his case under free speech. But the point is, class imbalance is essentially that if you're hunting for an exception, you never actually see the exception. You just see not Sasquatch, not Sasquatch. At some point, you really don't have any data on what you're looking for. Loch Ness Monster is another example. What is it that you're really looking for? What is the data that will tell you that you see it or not? Misprediction is another function of this. If you have lots of surveillance cameras and you're trying to look for things, at some point you get fatigue and people just start to say, oh, I saw something, and then, like, yeah, that's the 3rd time today you saw something, so you're, crying wolf, you're off the job. Actually, a fix for this is that we're building analytics because the computers are able to find things without fatigue, because humans tend to have fatigue when they look for data, and they tend to have bias. So, for example, somebody asked me, we've got a physical perimeter, and I want to know all the things that come up to the perimeter but don't actually trip the perimeter that are human. So can you distinguish in our data, in our video data, deer, for example, from humans, only flag humans, and only humans that don't come across our perimeter, right? So it's interesting because they've got lots of infrared tripwires and stuff. So here's an actual map that a graduate student did. It's pretty clever, which shows that the number of people increases as the Sasquatch sightings increase over 92 years. So you see in real data analysis how you get more and more sightings as more and more people are out there with their cameras. You would think with all the video cameras we have and all of the phones everybody's carrying all the time now, we would have the ability to see a Sasquatch. So this is how people keep seeing them, because they have more and more sensors and more false sightings. So it's cry wolf and an imbalance in data. Another quick example of imbalance in data. This is a super famous example, but I still like to use it because it's basically the planes were coming back from World War II, and they were measuring the bullet holes to figure out where to put armor, and then somebody pointed out, these are the planes that came back. You're measuring the holes that are not going to like protect the planes. So if you measure where the holes aren't, that's probably where they get hit that shoot them down. This is the actual bullet analysis. So you can see if you put armor in those blank spots, those planes might be more likely to come back. So it should tell you something about how to break it, right? So if you can fake the data, that's what I'm saying. If you can feed people bad information, run around in a Bigfoot suit, eventually they'll see you. So high dimension inefficacy is a great quote by Stephen Wright. You know, hey, you have two different colored socks on. He's like, yeah, I know, but to me they're the same because I go by thickness. So the more dimensions you add, the harder it is to do analysis. This is a function of like chaff. When you fire chaff out of a plane, it looks like, you know, there's a bunch of planes around, and so your heat-seeking missiles go after one of the chaff. So as you add more and more and more dimensions, that would be a heat dimension, but movement becomes harder and harder to do analysis. And so the predictive power you have in big data environments is really relative to the number of dimensions you have to process. And so if you get into hundreds of more dimensions, it gets slower and slower. So try to look diverse. Try to change your appearance often, and it becomes harder for people to pinpoint you. Although I just came through the TSA yesterday with my global entry. You know, you walk in, it takes a picture, it prints it out, and you go to the TSA guy right after with your picture, and the guy said, that's definitely you. I was really disappointed. I was like, oh, that looks exactly like me. So there's no way for me to shave the beard in between the picture being taken and the TSA guard, apparently. All right, so here's another example. This is fooling anti-spam engines, where basically, if you think about what spam engines are doing, they're trained to look for spam. This is a great example of big data analysis. And yet, when they go into the real world, they have to continue learning because spam changes. Of course, our adversaries are changing their attacks. So the adversaries know this, and some researchers have studied this, because what they're trying to do is figure out how they were trained and then change the look of spam so that it bypasses the spam filters. You can think of this as, I have the example here of the drill sergeant, but people who are trained by the military to spot enemy aircraft, if you learn how they're trained and what to spot, you can simply change the appearance of the aircraft, and then suddenly they don't see you anymore, right? So it's a simple learn about what their algorithm was that they used, or learn what the data was. And a lot of spam engines learn on public data. So you download the same data set, you learn their data, and then you just simply bypass because you know what they look for and you can test it. This happens also in the malware industry. So the third and strange one, I think, is missing values. This is where you can just break the sensors. So when you think about this Internet of Things, or the world that we're all moving to with lots of sensors and lots of personal data, think about how those are faulty. Think about how you can break them and make them give bad data. There's a competition, for example, for who runs the fastest down the Embarcadero using some of these running sensors. Who doesn't want to get onto a bicycle and just ride really fast, right? And the sensor won't know if you're over a certain speed that you're obviously not running, or isn't detecting in terms of dimensionality that you're not bouncing like a runner would. You're riding smoothly, so it would immediately discount your data. So you can break sensors, you can interfere with the sensors. Perhaps my best example of this is I had laser eye surgery, and before I had laser eye surgery, everything was two-dimensional. I haven't seen many people talk about this, but I had an astigmatism that was so bad, I had really thick glasses, that when you threw a ball at me, all I saw was a circle getting larger or smaller. So, right, I couldn't actually do hand-eye coordination because that ball would get bigger and bigger and bigger, but there was no depth, right? There was no dimension. So also on sailboats, I could look at a sail, but when it went in and out, I didn't see it really move, I just saw it change shape. But as soon as I had the surgery, now suddenly my sensors are fixed. I can actually see the surface of the ball. I can refocus on it as it's moving, so I can tell it's moving at me. So improving sensors significantly changes your ability to perceive risk. I can actually catch things now if you throw them at me. So let's get into the last part of this. What does this all mean in terms of risk? All right, what we're really doing is going back to, because we're talking about intelligence, because we're talking about machine learning on data sets, we're really talking about philosophy. And Hume is one of my favorite philosophers, very unpopular philosopher at his time compared to Rousseau, who had all the ladies. Nobody really paid attention to Hume. But he's turned out to be the better thinker. He said the wise proportion belief to evidence. And what we're really trying to do is find ways to find threats and understand when data is bad. So we need to know, with predictive models, where to focus our energies. And this is why more and more we're not doing vulnerability patching anymore, just flat patching. It's because we're wasting time patching things that don't get attacked. And there's a lot of interesting new data on that. So one way of looking at this is looking at the actual adversaries. And a lot of the academic research being done is about these very simplistic models. So Watson won chess, for example. Well, chess has very simple rules, right? And it's just a speed thing at that point. How many mistakes can it perceive in the future relative to somebody it's playing? And the rules of engagement are so simple, it's kind of like looking at old warfare. Again, my historic background, you'd look at when some group would march with old rules into battle, and like the United States, when it went to Cuba, walked down the street with Civil War style regimens, and then the Spanish had been using much more effective methods against, well, there's a much more, I guess you'd say, bloody battle between the Spanish and the locals. And so when the Americans arrived, they were already using a much more advanced form of warfare. So the guerrilla warfare that the Americans ran into completely devastated the US troops. So the more complex the actual environment that we see is where you have unlimited matrix of opponents. In other words, you have people that have relationships that they use against you, so they might have somebody who's on their side that's helping them. You tend to get these ill-defined rules, and so the active adversary reality is where we really can use some of our machine learning to do a better job. So we're also looking into the future. So we want to see that, that we can stop things that are going to happen. And if you look at the legal profession, for example, they're often looking at precedents, and they're looking at risks from the past. We do a lot of analysis of risks from the past, but we have to move to our position where we can predict things before they get to us. Very different than the other industries that tend to work in this area. And so we need to look at them in terms of being more than random also. We can't just have attackers come in and say, well, that was by chance. We have to actually say this is more likely to happen than not. And we have to be able to figure out the difference between widespread attacks and targeted attacks. So these are some of the characteristics we should be looking for. And just two caveats here. We have to be able to do it for non-insiders. If somebody is root already, the true insider attack, we won't be able to detect that because they actually are indistinguishable from the person who is attacking. A good example of this is you used to find that a married couple would divorce and then come at you and say, that person is using my account. You'd say, well, you were married. You were the same account to us, literally. And now that you're divorced and you think of yourselves as different, unique, and separate, that's your distinction, which we have no record of. We have no way of knowing. So if you allow people to be root and actually take over an identity completely and become a partnership, essentially, then it's much harder to detect. That really can bypass these systems as advanced as they get. And we also have to look at results. So this is an example of where people become bankers. So if they actually get into the system to the point where they can change the rules of banking, then you really can't detect them as an attack as would somebody trying to game the system. So fraud becomes basically impossible to see in systems if somebody is in charge of the bank that determines what people can do. Or the economy might be a better example. So, right, if they can mimic whitelists or what's ethical behavior in financial trading, it's not really going to be detected. Or if they can modify the blacklists because they have control of the blacklists, we're not going to detect them. All right, so with that in mind, so you can see sort of how you can attack and you can see what we're looking for. This is really what the trust plan has been. So we're building these three categories of trusts. So first, the advanced security tools that we're building are going to protect against the theft of training data sets and algorithms, right? We'll look for threats coming in, we'll detect fraud coming in. So advanced security is all about detecting threats before they reach a level that they've actually stolen the goods. Backup and restore is actually often not talked about in security anymore, but it really is the antidote to poisonous data. So what I like to say now is if you can respond within a certain time frame, we like to say respond within 2 hours, it reduces your risk 60%. But not only do you want to respond and catch the attacker, but if you can restore data, then of course people can continue operating as before. And if you have integrity because you have backup and restore, then you can of course continue operating because you have some sense that this data has been poisoned and this data is valid. So a lot more tools are being developed that are in the backup and restore area related to security and threats. And then finally, continuous availability. So as the example in the 96 Ariane disaster, if you can avoid processing halts because you can switch over to other systems, you can reduce a significant amount of risk in big data environments. So a good example of that was in New York when they got flooded from the hurricane, or when 9/11 happened, a lot of processing stopped. So huge financial trading environments were basically down. But now we have the capability of moving that over geographic distance up to 200 kilometers. So if an environment went down, we can continue processing somewhere else. Major advantage over big data environments that don't have that, because the time it takes for them to get back online, the amount of data, 96 petabytes of data being restored, takes a long time. So just to sort of conclude here as the last few slides, here's an example of what it might look like, right? If you have a lot of data in an advanced security environment, I'll just take you through this one, not through all three. You're basically trying to figure out ways to build relationships. So back to the beginning, you have to have structure for something to be known. So here you see three examples of how you can build a simple differentiation between red or blue. You can build an association of things which are white, or you can build a connection which goes beyond that with some other dimension. So you can also start to predict then, because you can build a regression curve that says if we're going this direction, the next one's going to be over here. So these are basically the ways that we're using big data security, and what we're trying to protect is this ability to do this accurately without people poisoning the data. And so here's an example of how you would increase your ability to do measurement. Instead of just a password, which is a secret, you can actually ask people to give you lots more data, and by using that data, you can move up in the ability to confidently trust that person is who they say they are. So not just friend or foe, but you can say they're good, they're bad, they're ugly, or you can sort of say, you know, there's a heat map for them. They look a lot more like somebody who's good than bad. And so this is an actual example of how you would look for fraud within a banking environment. So if somebody comes in and has certain behavior on a regular basis, then you can look for people who are doing things that are kind of irregular. Like every time you check your banking account, you probably follow a similar process. The one time you do something different, prompt you for more authentication. You're doing something that you haven't done before, why don't you put your password in again? Which can be annoying, but if you only do that for some percentage of people, you might actually be stopping fraud. And so that's exactly what's happening. We're basically moving from a world like this, where anybody who has a secret gets to be one of the bubbles, to a world where we say, okay, there's definitely something different about these three. They're doing something very different than all the others who had the secret. So why don't you give us something else to prove you are who you say you are? So where does it all go? I think this is the exciting part. I think the future systems will actually be able to detect risk themselves. I no longer will go out and try to patch a system. And I don't buy entirely into the system of decay that Netflix and others are promoting, which is that you treat everything like cattle. You don't treat them like pets. So if it fails, you just kill it. One of the reasons I don't believe that is because Netflix then becomes cattle. If it doesn't work, I kill it, and I go use some other provider. So using their own analogy would kill their service. So I think it's more subtle than that. I think it's actually you detect some degree of flaw, and then you allow a peer election, kind of the way Google works, right? The validity of risk comes from an election process of peers that are looking amongst themselves and saying this looks abnormal. So in 40,000 node clusters, in 140,000 node clusters, they're basically healing themselves. And at some point you can go in and intervene, but mostly they're deciding for themselves which nodes are still valid. So it becomes an elective game. And that's the stoplight example. We're starting to talk about stoplights deciding who gets to be red and who gets to be green, as opposed to having a central control. And so here's an example that we have from real life. In a 50 million event per month environment, a financial environment, we could review 1 of 2,000 events, and we can still catch above 92% of the fraud by looking at sophisticated heat maps of behavior and looking at the way things are behaving. So it's sort of a two-sided presentation in that sense. I'm talking on the one hand about how you get in and poison and how you try to make yourself look like, you know, a good person when you're actually a bad person. And on the other hand, I'm telling you, we have pretty good tools now and ways of figuring out when those people are attacking. And it's very different than what most discussions are today, which is perimeters, it's vulnerabilities, it's better passwords, right? This is a whole new way of looking at security, which really removes perimeters and looks at behavior and looks at surveillance as a positive thing. So I'd like to thank the NSA for making this possible by bringing this discussion up, you know, making it a topic that people want to listen to. And thank you for your time. Are there any questions? I guess I'll take questions. Yes?
So how do you distinguish particularly between the attack and the attacker? Do you spend time looking at the data, mining it to determine if somebody is using a multitude of attacks and they have a certain amount of persistence that it looks like they're going to eventually break in even if they haven't yet? Or is it really just looking at very sort of individual attack events?
So the question is, how do you detect attacker, friend from foe, essentially? Do you look at all of the data and try to figure out if there's a pattern, or do you look at whether someone's doing something different than they've been doing before? The answer is, it goes back to the beginning, like you start with structure. So you can't actually say friend from foe exists until you build that definition of what friend and foe look like. So yes to both. On the one hand, you look at the individual and say, this person has been doing this particular way over time, so that looks normal. So that is our definition of normal, so that is a friend. It gets into a little more than that, because you can have a relationship and say, if you give us this password, then you're legit. But then you can say, you can give us this password, plus you can give us this token, or you can give us this biometric, and then so those are ways of cheating, but ultimately, you really you define how their behavior is working to decide whether they're friend or foe. Back to the married couple example, you know, at what point do you know that they're actually attacking each other as opposed to married and happily married? It's kind of a decision that's up to them as opposed to you. But you can say, we've noticed a change in your behavior, and so we can change how we respond. We can block you and ask you for more credentials. Now if they don't have the other credentials, now you know they're actually, in other words, you can make the perimeter really tight and small just for the data they're accessing at that very one moment, and just prompt them for authentication specific to that data, right? And then the other hand is you look at all the data together to see if it's outside the norm. Yeah.
So if a particular foe in this case happens to be trying to compromise multiple accounts, you draw a corollary to an individual attacker who maybe is developing a particular profile, pattern of attacks across multiple accounts.
That's a great question. So the question is, do you draw a profile for someone who's attacking across multiple accounts? And that is exactly how some of the heat maps work. So, and the communication networks that RSA has, for example. So as you see behavior coming that looks suspicious, you flag it, and then you notify everybody. And if everybody starts to see that, whether it's across accounts you own or across all accounts everyone owns, then you're communicating up that this is abnormal behavior, and everyone blocks that and reports it essentially for investigation. So it is literally, it's very primitive right now. It's peer-based notification, but it is literally going to neighborhood watch-like notification where everyone's noticing something and reporting it, and eventually an authority can intervene that has some responsibility there. Yep. That's a product that actually works today, that way. Yep. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you get along with Evgeny Morozov?
I've just read his stuff. I don't know him personally. Question is, do I know Evgeny? Why do you ask? Let me.
You know, your line of thought about big data inside of countries, he likes to argue.
All right. Yeah, I'd like to talk to more people about this. I do tend to be a contrarian, and I don't mind taking the contrarian position just to expand people's thinking and find flaws. Ultimately, that's my nature. It's what everybody's doing when they're hacking is trying to find some flaw and then improve the system by telling people maybe you should fix this. Even if you can't disrupt the entire system, maybe it's good, you still find a single flaw, they fix that, that's good. So I like taking that contrarian view, finding flaws in people's arguments. One of the biggest things I found, though, recently is that Netflix, for example, and all these companies promoting this like cattle analogy. I'm like, just stop. Like, stop treating things like you should kill them if they fail, and start thinking about how you can make them more intelligent so they can survive. Because this sort of rapid destruction, although it worked for a while for us, it was better than before, it's definitely not the future. It's like we should become vegetarians too, but that's a different story. Any other questions? That's true. So comment from Netflix is Chaos Monkey is about availability. It's about providing operational. So that's true, but I feel like my job in the sense of building trust for big data and for cloud is to bring availability back into the security fold. It used to be CIA, availability was part of our responsibility. And disaster recovery and business continuity, which I worked on a lot for many years, used to be in our wheelhouse. But now more and more, VMware is a good example of this. They do a lot of operational stuff, and they just say it's not security. It's for operations. It's for uptime. It's for keeping the systems running. And I do agree that's a good stopgap. We should go there. And sometimes it's nice in security to hand things off and say, you guys keep operations running while we look at advanced threats. But I think if we pigeonhole security too much into just incident response and just finding flaws, we're kind of losing the integration we need, which is, for example, when you're looking at an overall strategy, you first want availability. That is the first thing security needs, because if things go down, there's no point, right? Vulnerabilities don't matter. So it really is a concern of security to have things up. The second part is you got to restore good data, because if you have uptime but bad data going everywhere, it really doesn't do anyone any good. A bad Oracle database spread evenly across the country is still bad data in an Oracle database. So you need to have good restores, and then finally you put security on top of that. And so that's the trust model that I like to promote. Like, I agree, for now it's good to have really good operational practices with the Chaos Monkey, but long term I think we got to get it more into the integrated trust model, which is where you're really looking at security and backup and recovery on top of availability as an integrated plan. Yes. Okay. So the question is, what if you have an attacker that's very short-lived? And I just came back from Mexico where they told me about how the Colombians would, or the cartel, or the people who were trading drugs, would literally drive down wealthy streets, hook into a telephone wire, make a call for some drug trade, and disappear. So one call on one house somewhere in a neighborhood. And they were able, by looking at phone records, to detect for example, that was a bad thing. It was a call that was out of the norm. So the way you do that is by understanding norm, structure. If you build a good enough structure, then you have knowledge. But you have to have that structure. Otherwise, that one-time aberration disappears because you really have a weak structure. Yeah. It's like when I got caught by a red light camera. You know how I got out of the red light camera ticket? I called a lawyer and I said, make this go away. Because I knew this was a vulnerability in the system. They have ways of making the law work that would make the ticket go away. But unbeknownst to me, I've done that a couple times. So sometimes the most direct attack path and the most direct response are not obvious. But if you know how the entire system works, in other words, if you have knowledge of the structure that the system is part of, you can then use it to detect an attack and also protect yourself. Oh, we're out of time. Getting the cut message. All right, thank you very much.